Before we talk about intervals, we need to remind ourselves about steps. The first thing to remember is that the half step is the smallest increment in music. All notes are equally spaced, one half step apart. That is, an A is one half step from an A sharp, and an A sharp is one half step from a B, and so on and so forth. 12 half steps completes one cycle through all 12 musical note names. And finally, a half step is a fixed ratio of the frequencies of two adjacent notes. Now we can talk about intervals. The first thing to do is to understand what an interval is. There are three things that we can say about intervals. First, an interval is the distance between two musical notes. Since the distance between each note can be measured as one half step, we will also be able to measure intervals in terms of a number of half steps. And so we also know that any interval is characterized by its own particular ratio of frequencies. Secondly, an interval has direction, magnitude, and a reference point. A half step from a C sharp is a C and a D. Without knowing the direction, it is ambiguous which interval is intended. Likewise, without the magnitude, an interval is ambiguous. Certainly 3 half steps up is not the same as 4 half steps up. Without a reference point, an interval has nowhere to start. 3 half steps might tell you the ratio of the frequencies of the two notes in the interval, but it doesn't tell you the frequency of either. All three components are important when giving an interval. Lastly, the interval is a building block of chords, meaning that before we can start talking about chords, we need to have a firm grasp on intervals. You walk before you run, and you understand intervals before you understand chords. Okay, there are 12 basic intervals. In the table to the right, you can see the names of the interval of a certain number of half steps. One thing to note about the table is that it gives only the magnitudes of the intervals. It does not give either the direction or a reference point to the interval. There are several things that we can notice about the names of the intervals, though. First of all, you can see 4 distinct types of intervals: perfect, major, minor, and tritone. The type of interval describes how dissonant the interval is. Mathematically, dissonance is a measure of how close the frequency ratio is to a simple fraction, that is a ratio of integers. Perfect intervals are the least dissonant, then major intervals, then minor intervals, then the tritone. Next, you can see a pattern of increasing degrees. Prime means first, and octave means eighth. And so you see that the 12 basic intervals contain the numbers 1 through 8, though some numbers are used multiple times. Also notice that the tritone does not have a number associated with it. We will talk about the tritone a little later, but keep this in mind. From the interval type and interval number, we can construct the abbreviations that are typically used. Ignoring the tritone for a moment, you can see that each interval type is given a one-letter abbreviation. A perfect interval gets an uppercase P, a major interval an uppercase M, a minor interval a lowercase m. Then we attach the interval number. The tritone is special. Since it has no number, its abbreviation is 2 uppercase T's. The interval number will be particularly important when constructing chords. We can now talk about 2 more interval types: augmented intervals and diminished intervals. These intervals increase or decrease the interval size by 1 half step, respectively. For instance, an augmented fifth would be an interval of 8 half steps, or equivalent to a minor sixth interval. This is important because we can now refer to the same interval by 2 different interval numbers, namely 5 and 6. Even more important is being able to name the tritone by a number at all. As a tritone, it does not have an interval number, but it can also be referred to as an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth, and so it has 2 interval numbers and 3 interval names. Also, notice the abbreviations of augmented and diminished intervals. The augmented type gets an uppercase A, and a diminished interval gets an uppercase D. Another common augmented interval is the example I gave just a moment ago, namely an augmented fifth. Notice also that the augmented and diminished intervals would not work very well with intervals whose interval number is plural. For instance, would a diminished third be diminished from a major third or from a minor third? We've been looking at the 12 basic intervals, but there are in fact many more. The 12 basic intervals exist within 1 octave. When we construct chords, we will find it useful to use many of the intervals from within 2 octaves. Of course, there are as many octaves as the human ear can perceive, and then even more. But for our purposes, only 2 octave of intervals is necessary. Furthermore, we will find that there is a pattern in each additional octave. In the table to the left, I have extended the intervals to the 11th degree. But we quickly see a pattern emerging. The major ninth, for example, is an octave above a major second, and so it is the same interval type, but its interval number is 7 more. This is the same with all other extended intervals. We could instead diagram intervals in a different way. This circle diagram may look familiar, much like the diagram demonstrating the cyclical nature of note names. This diagram is a little different, however. The red dot at the top represents our reference point. Moving clockwise does not represent increasing the pitch, but rather the interval size. Therefore, moving counterclockwise doesn't really make sense. Otherwise, we could have negative intervals. Furthermore, intervals are not really cyclical. 12 half steps, for instance, is not a perfect prime, but a perfect octave. And so, to make this more accurate, we would need to add a second circle of interval names for extended intervals. However, in this diagram, it is much easier to see the pattern of extended interval names. Notice how the interval number of the outer circle is 7 more than the inner circle, but that the interval type is the same. Another thing that we can see is the value of the tritone. The tritone gets its name from being an interval with a magnitude of 3 whole steps. Furthermore, we see that it is directly opposite of the reference point, meaning that it is half an octave in magnitude. Therefore, a B, for example, is a tritone above and below an F, which makes for some interesting chords and melodies that use the tritone. Lastly, we can talk about what are called complementary or inverted intervals. This trick will give us some help in 2 scenarios. Let's imagine that we know the interval between 2 notes, say G up to a C. This interval is a perfect fifth. Now, we want to know the interval from C up to a G and G down to a C. So in either case, we are changing either the order or the direction, but not both. In the first case, the 2 intervals combine to form an octave from G to another G, G up to a C, then C up to a G. We know that an octave has 12 half steps, and that a perfect fifth has 7. Therefore, the remaining interval needs 5 half steps, and so it is a perfect fourth. In the second case, we are also spanning an octave, but from C to C instead of G to G. We have G up to a C and G down to a C. Therefore, in the same way, the intervals have to add to an octave, or 12 steps. The perfect fifth has 7 half steps, so the remaining interval needs 5 half steps, which is again a perfect fourth. Therefore, a perfect fourth is a complement to a perfect fifth, because their sum is 1 octave. If we did this for all the intervals, we would find that a pattern emerges, which is quite helpful. As we noticed in our example, the complement to a perfect interval is another perfect interval. The complement to a major interval is a minor interval, which also means that the complement of a minor interval is a major interval. And the last thing to notice is that the sum of the interval numbers is 9. Lastly, if we look at our circle diagram showing only the basic intervals, we can see that the complementary intervals are across from one another if we draw a vertical axis through the center of the circle. The last thing that we can talk about with regard to intervals is the concept of ear training. Ear training is a process by which people learn to identify musical concepts by ear, such as intervals, chords, scales, rhythms, etc. For instance, I could play 2 notes, and instead of plucking around a piano for 5 minutes, a trained musician can tell me what interval I played just from listening to the sound. The power of ear training is that it helps musicians deconstruct what they hear quickly and effectively, which means that they could learn to play the musical piece with greater precision, or analyze the piece with greater insight, or communicate with his band members with greater speed or accuracy. In effect, ear training is turning the theoretical skill into a practical one. Being able to identify intervals and find their complements is not very useful unless you can use that skill to analyze or produce good music, which means it needs to be something you can do quickly and effectively. If you are serious about being a good musician, either as a professional or as an amateur, it is very useful to begin a process of ear training. There are lots of ways to ear train, but you mostly need to find what works best for you. Some tricks and tips that I have used have been things like finding simple songs or melodies that have a specific interval. Then, if I hear an interval, I can sing or hum that song to see if those intervals are the same. One example is the jingle from NBC. The interval from N to B is up a perfect fifth. The interval in Old MacDonald in the word MacDonald is down a perfect fourth. In this way, I am training myself to identify intervals from songs I know, so that I can identify intervals in songs I don't know. Or you could just sit at a piano, or any instrument for that matter, and try to hum intervals that you think of. Play a C, then without playing an F, try to hum it, then check to see if you got it. Or you could have a friend play or hum intervals, while you try to guess at what they are. In the same way, you can find a computer program which does the same thing. Many schools, for instance, with music theory classes, are equipped with computers with ear training software. One of the most productive methods of ear training is to learn to play songs by ear, because you'll not only be training your ears, but also learning an instrument. As a child, my grandpa taught me to play piano by ear. I would sit at a piano and hum a song I know. Then I would try to play the song, humming the intervals and playing them one by one.